Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you very much to Ong Tuan for the invitation. I'm on a possibly ropey internet connection, so let's hope the force is with us. I will attempt to just launch a PowerPoint presentation. I thought it might be played from there, but if you want me to play it from here, then I'll do it from here. 1 second. So, yeah, can you see that? Right. If I put that on my
let me show the PowerPoint for you on here. Okay, you just speak and then
I think it'll be a bit easier. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. So people have spoken about what China has been doing in the South China Sea recently in the last 2 years as a fait accompli. So my question is, what has China accomplished in the last 2 years? And I think the significance of China's island building lies less in what it has done so far than what it might be about to do. I think it's worth remembering that even though China has been dredging and building since September 2013, it hasn't occupied any new territory. 6 of the 7 recently built islands lie on reefs that China settled in 1988, and the 7th, Mischief Reef, was occupied in 1994. So the question is, what will China do next? Do we have the slides up? I'll just check. Hello?
Yeah,
do we have
the slide up.
Yeah, do you have the one that says current concerns?
Which page are you at now?
Current concerns.
Current concern. Okay, yes.
Yes. So in my view, concern should focus on 3 areas of sea: the Vanguard Bank off the Vietnamese coast, the Reed Bank or Recto Bank off the Philippines coast, and around the Luconia Shoals and the James Shoal off the Malaysian coast. All 3 have significant oil and gas potential. That's not to say that hydrocarbons are the sole reason for China's island building. There are many motivations reflecting China's many security interests and its many internal lobbies. Next slide, please. Back in April, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson provided a list of these motivations. It was a long list, perhaps to camouflage the most important items: territorial defense, including the assertion of sovereignty for its own sake, and maritime rights, the harvesting of mineral resources and fish around the islands. In contrast to those such as, for example, the Australian analyst Hugh White, who argue that the South China Sea confrontation is all about a clever plan to ensnare the US into very difficult commitments with its allies and partners and then to break those commitments, I concluded that in the Chinese worldview, and I disagree with this, but in the Chinese worldview, the island building is a defensive move. However, I would argue that that worldview is founded upon a strong, though very misplaced, sense of historical entitlement. China may not yet be a great power, but it's already acquiring great power autism. Next slide, please. So ever since Deng Xiaoping ordered the creation of China's first special economic zone in Shenzhen in 1980, national prosperity has depended upon an arc of cities around the country's coast. The Communist Party leadership fears intervention against these cities and ports by the United States, either as a direct move against its rule or perhaps within the context of a Taiwan crisis. The new islands, equipped with over-the-horizon radar, hypersonic anti-ship missiles and anti-submarine capabilities, would presumably form part of some kind of Chinese sea denial strategy to try and protect its coast. Next slide, please. Another reason is that China's been a net importer of food since 2007, and in turn 2 years ago it overtook the US as the world's largest oil importer. Foreign trade makes up 40% of GDP in China compared to less than 1/3 in the US, yet the country has no clear access to the open sea. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't appear to believe that free trade and the global commons are sufficient to deliver security. And I would suggest that the more that American officials or foreign affairs experts talk about offshore balancing, which is code really for starving China into submission in the event of a conflict, the more the Chinese military will make plans to try and make that more difficult. By creating runways, bases, and logistics depots on the reefs, China is creating the capacity to project power closer to the Straits of Malacca to protect those trade routes. The Chinese Defense White Paper, published in May, handed the PLA a new strategic task: to safeguard the security of China's overseas interests, especially in the maritime domain. According to the white paper, the PLA Navy will gradually shift its focus from offshore waters defence to a combination of offshore waters defence with, quotes, open seas protection. Next slide, please. Another military reason may be the desire to construct in the South China Sea what submariners call a bastion, an area of relatively deep water in which ballistic missile submarines can hide. The Soviet Union turned the Sea of Okhotsk, northeast of Japan, into such a bastion during the Cold War. China's development of a large submarine base at Yulin on the southern tip of Hainan Island, combined with the recent constructions in the Spratly, suggest Beijing may have borrowed this idea. Next slide, please. On a regional level, China's island building is presumably intended to deter Southeast Asian claimants from exploiting the resources around the Spratlys. Shorter supply lines and reliable bases will enable more Coast Guard and naval vessels and aircraft to be on station. The extra radar and local deployment of patrol aircraft will facilitate greater maritime domain awareness. Next slide, please. Access to fisheries is important. As incomes rose in China between 1970 and 2010, the proportion of fish in the national diet quintupled to 25 kilos a year. As it gets richer, this number will presumably rise. Overfishing has forced crews to look further out to sea. In 1988, 90% of the Chinese fishing industry worked inshore, just close to the coast. By 2006, 60% of the catch in Guangzhou province was offshore. Trawlers received tens of thousands of dollars in grants to expand their capacity to fish further away from home. And hundreds, possibly even thousands of fishing boats from Hainan province received between $300 and $500 a day to go fishing in disputed waters. The next slide, please. And then there's oil and gas. Vietnam claims the Vanguard Bank and leased the hydrocarbon rights to Talisman, formerly of Canada, now part of Repsol. But in July 2014, the Chinese rights to sail into the same part of the sea were sold to Bright Oil, a Hong Kong-based company with strong connections to the Chinese political establishment. It's possible that this could be a prelude to renewed efforts by China to drill there once the supporting military and Coast Guard infrastructure is in place in the Spratlys. Next slide, please. Malaysia already has active oil production operations around the Luconia Shoals within its claimed exclusive economic zone off the coast of Borneo. However, in June this year, the Malaysian government revealed that a Chinese Coast Guard vessel had been anchored near the shoals for 2 years. China is also thought to regard the James Shoal area even closer to the Malaysian coast as also oil-rich. Next one. A tragicomic translation error in the 1930s resulted in Chinese schoolchildren being taught to this day that the James Shoal is the country's southernmost territory. In fact, there is no territory at the shoal. It's an underwater feature. Next slide. Currently, about a third of the electricity used on the main Philippine island of Luzon is generated by gas from the Malampaya field off Palawan. Philippine media reports suggest that Malampaya will run out within 10 years. However, there appears to be plenty of gas under the Reed Bank, which, although inside the Philippines' its claimed exclusive economic zone, is also well within the U-shaped line claimed by China. In March 2015, Forum Energy, London-listed but Philippine-controlled, revealed it had been denied permission by the Philippine government to drill on Reed Bank because of objections from China, and the company was forced to delist its shares from the London Stock Exchange. We can be reasonably sure that China will attempt to obstruct any attempt by the Philippines to drill in this area. Mischief Reef, with its new runway, is just 60 nautical miles away. It's easy to term these resource grabs as offensive moves, but from a Chinese perspective, I would argue that it's the Southeast Asian countries that are trespassing on Chinese historic territory. This is a Chinese argument, not mine. Asserting sea control in the Spratlys is, I would argue, in Beijing's view, all about defending national sovereignty and protecting maritime rights. Next slide, please. Now, I would argue that this view of history is nonsense. No government administered the islands until the 20th century. Chinese interest began in 1909, when in response to a Japanese merchant extracting guano from Pratas Island, the governor of Guangzhou province launched an expedition to the Paracels. China expressed no interest in the Spratlys until 1935, and no Chinese official ever visited the Spratlys before the 12th of December 1946. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, in the first half of the 20th century, an emerging nationalist consciousness resulting from the sense of national humiliation inflicted by foreign powers created a strong belief in the South China, that the South China Sea was historically Chinese. Can we move on to the next one? National humiliation, please. Its origins lie, this sense that the South China Sea is Chinese, its origins lie in an intellectual car crash, combining misunderstandings about history, namely that the Southeast Asian territories that once sent tribute to the Chinese emperor considered themselves to be part of a Chinese domain, with the introduction of Westphalian-type borders into Asia. It's noticeable that whereas China has settled all its land borders with almost all of its neighbours, India being the exception, it's in dispute on all three of its maritime frontiers. I can go into more on that if you want. Next slide, please. It's vital to grasp the significance of this sense of historical entitlement because it underpins everything that China is doing. I say there's a symbiotic relationship between nationalist voices using resource arguments to justify their historic claim and state agencies using nationalist arguments to justify the resource grab. Next slide, please. China, both the ROC and the PRC, advanced a claim and then a physical presence over the Spratly Islands as their knowledge and capabilities grew in the 20th century. It's been a slow and fitful advance, but it has been consistent. I don't believe it will end until China occupies every land feature in the sea and controls the sea spaces in between. When China talks about negotiating with rival claimants, it's hard to believe it means anything other than ultimately persuading those rivals to abandon their position. Although people remember Deng's shelve disputes pursue joint development dictum, they always forget that the first part of that dictum was sovereignty is ours. Next slide, please. It's not over yet, is the slide. It's not over yet. I think it's game on. China remains a minority shareholder in the Spratlys. Vietnam occupies more than half the features, and so far, China hasn't used force to evict any of the other claimants from their possessions in the Spratlys. People will say, what about Johnson Reef? But Johnson Reef in 1988, forces from China and Vietnam landed simultaneously, more or less, on the same feature and had a fist fight, which eventually turned into a gun battle, killing 64 Vietnamese. I would say the same is true on Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese haven't evicted any Philippine forces from the feature, closed off access. Just closed off access. It's a technical point, perhaps, but I think that it is significant. We need to unpack the Chinese term active defense here. In the South China Sea, it has come to mean waiting for a pretext to take offensive action. As I heard Major General Chen Zhou explain last year, win by striking only after the enemy has struck. Final slide, please, the one that says UNCLOS solution. But by sticking to its U-shaped line claim, despite the case being brought by the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, China is heading for direct conflict with the current norms of international law. It's not hard to see why it rejects a solution based upon UNCLOS. It would lose any hope of access to wide areas of sea. China would prefer an imaginative interpretation of customary international law that would recognize an historic claim to all the waters inside the U-shaped line. It seems Beijing no longer regards UNCLOS as a neutral arbiter of disputes, but rather as a partisan weapon being wielded to sever China from its historic rights. Some Western analysts have told me they believe the U-shaped line is just an opening gambit from which Beijing will negotiate a compromise. I think they're wrong. It is the destination towards which China is inexorably heading. That's the end of my paper.